Onto your headphones and pour your favorite beverage. It's time for the Kickin or Stickin Fantasy Football Podcast. Now, fresh off the sidelines, your host, Matt McPeak.
Fantasy freaks and geeks, what's up? This is the XFL Week 3 preview episode of the Kickin or Stickin Fantasy Football Podcast, where I try to make your fantasy decisions just a little bit easier. Week 2, we had some ups and downs. Matt McGloin putting his entire coaching staff on blast. We saw our first successful 3-point attempt after a touchdown, albeit from the 5-yard line instead of the 10-yard line. We'll get to that. But all in all, it was a good week. I missed on my 3-leg parlay last week with the St. Louis-Houston game going over. I really thought that one was going to finish under with the two best defenses after week 1, but it was not meant to be. But I got another one for you this week, which we'll get to, and I also got a FanDuel lineup that I think is primed to do well. Of course, we will preview all 4 of the football games coming up this weekend, and we'll try and get you ready for week 3 of the XFL. But let's start by taking a look at some of the guys that took a step back after last week, and some guys that had big games in week 2. So we saw a lot of wide receivers in week 2 take a step back. One of them being Daniel Williams. He led the league in receiving yards in week 1. Then he only caught 3 of 4 balls for 22 yards in week 2. Austin Proehl, he had 5 catches on 10 targets for 88 yards and 2 touchdowns in week 1. Pretty awesome stat line. And then he followed it up with only 1 catch on 4 targets for -1 yards in week 2. No good there. Flynn Nagel caught all 6 of his targets in week 1, and then last week only caught 2 of his 3 targets in week 2. And then Joe Horn had 8 targets week 1, but only caught 2 of them, and as a result, he was only targeted twice in week 2, and he didn't catch either of them. And then Sammy Coates continuing his bad catch rate in week 2, only catching 1 of his 4 targets. He now has 3 catches on 13 targets through the first 2 weeks of the season. You don't have to be a math guy to realize that's not very good. On the other side of the coin, there was a few wide receivers that gave us a second week of big production, most notably Mr. Cam Phillips. 3 touchdown day at St. Louis. He now has the second most targets and the third most receptions and receiving yards in the league with his 4 touchdowns. He had a great game last week. Nelson Spruce also had a multi-touchdown game in week 2. Spruce is number 1 in targets, receptions, and receiving yards. Keenan Reynolds showed his versatility in week 2 with a 68-yard touchdown catch after catching an extra point attempt in week 1. The DC Defender wide receiver trio, first team so far to have 2 wide receivers put up 60 yards in a game, Rashad Ross and DeAndre Tompkins. Eli Rogers also played really well. He was very involved. And then the St. Louis Battlehawks wide receivers, LaDamian Washington and DeMornay Pearson-L, both scored and saw almost 20 targets between the 2 of them. So there's some wide receivers that played really well in week 2. Looking at some running backs, 4 runners saw double-digit carries in week 1. And then in week 2, we saw 12 running backs hit double-digit carries. I think that's something we're going to continue to see. I think a lot of these quarterbacks are struggling, and I think you're going to see teams try and run the ball a little bit more this week. Despite only 2 targets on the season so far, Matt Jones caught his first touchdown in Week 2. Christian Michael bounced back after a horrible Week 1 and gave us 60 total yards on 15 carries and 2 catches. Jarrell Presley, back-to-back weeks with 13 touches. That's definitely encouraging. Donnell Pumphrey led DC in touches after only 5 touches in Week 1. All 3 Dragon running backs had at least 10 carries in their home opener. Cameron Artis-Payne, best day for an XFL running back so far this season. 130 total yards, 2 touchdown day. He saw 14 carries and caught all 5 of his targets. He was fantastic. Quentin Flowers' effect on the running game was felt again as the Vipers rushed for over 140 yards in Week 2. The Roughnecks had 4 ball carriers run the ball for 10 yards or more. So those Roughneck ball carriers are definitely pretty explosive. Only 2 tight ends had over 30 yards in Week 2, and wouldn't you know it, both of them are on the Dallas Renegades. So those Dallas tight ends are really playing well. Definitely surprising me, at least, for sure. All right, let's take a look at the XFL Week 2 betting results. So DC was giving 7 points to New York. They won by 27 at home and kept the total under 48 by keeping the Guardians out of the end zone. Seattle getting points in their home opener made me about $70. FanDuel Sportsbook had a little thing. If you put a $50 live bet, you got like a $25 site credit or whatever. So I put $50 on them when they were down 9-0, and I think I got like $68 plus the 25. Thank you very much. They were getting 3 points and they won by 8. Only 3 touchdowns in the game. 2 of them were pick sixes. So the total stayed under 45. Dallas went to LA and gave the Wildcats 6.5 points. Thanks to 4 unsuccessful extra point attempts, the game stayed under 45.5. There's definitely a trend coming here. And the game that screwed me the most, St. Louis at Houston. St. Louis was getting 8 points in the highest over-under of the week at 50.5. Houston won the game but failed to cover after allowing a 36-yard touchdown pass from Tiamu to Damian Washington with less than 2 minutes to go. So that was a heartbreaker. So far through 8 games, the home team is now 6-2 with 3 of the 4 home teams won in Week 2. The under is now 6-2 on the season. Only 1 of the 4 games went over in Week 2. 3 of the 4 home favorites have covered the spread. The home dog has won each week so far. New York in Week 1, Seattle in Week 2. There are now 3 home dogs in Week 3, LA, Seattle, and Tampa Bay. But be careful about following the trends in Week 3. FanDuel and everyone else, I'm sure, has dropped the average over-under numbers both of the last 2 weeks. So after Week 1, it dropped 2.5 points, and then after Week 2, it dropped 4.5 points. So I know a lot of people are joking around, I'll just take the under on every game because it seems like it's hitting in every game. But definitely take a second look at these over-unders. They've definitely come down to earth. I think a lot of these books were expecting a lot more high scoring, and it just hasn't really happened so far in this young XFL season. All right, let's get into these games here. So first we got the New York Guardians at St. Louis Battlehawks. Both teams are 1-1. The over-under is 40.5 right now, and the Guardians are getting 10 points as of the recording of this show on Thursday night. So 10 points is a lot of points. Matt McGloin looked like garbage in Week 2. He had only 42 yards passing, completed only 42% of his passes. I'm sorry, there's no way that's right. I think he had, he did have 42 yards passing and a 42% completion rate. That's kind of weird. And he threw 2 interceptions. He was missing on deep throws all game. And then, like I said earlier, he threw his coaches under the bus. So he's got to play better this week if the Guardians are going to have any shot to go into St. Louis for their home opener and come away with a win. I expect the St. Louis fans to show up to what they're calling the Battle Dome at America's Center. Maybe not to the same extent that the Seattle fans showed up last week, but this city lost their professional football team a few years ago when the Rams packed up and moved out to Los Angeles. And with the Battlehawks needing a win to avoid an 0-3 start, I'm sorry, they're 1-1, so they lose this game, they'll drop to 1-2. I think it's going to be a tough place for McGloin to go, and the Guardians' offense. They just looked confused last week. I don't know if 1 week off is really going to cure those problems. There's not much to take from last week's game for New York and their offense, which looked so bad. Mikhail McKay did lead the team in receiving yards again last week, but that's not saying much considering he only had 30 receiving yards. And like I said, Joe Horn saw his targets drop from 8 down to 2 last week, and he's only caught 2 of his 10 targets on the season. So not looking good for good old Mr. Joe Horn. Jake Powell's lone target in last week's game came on the first play of New York's opening drive. Week 1, he was very involved with 6 targets. I wouldn't be surprised if they try to throw the ball deep a little less in Week 3 and try and get Powell more involved on those easier over the middle of the field throws, try and get McGloin a little more comfortable. He was also quoted as saying, "At no point in the game was I comfortable. Did I feel like we were going to win the game?" So, yeah, I think they're going to try and get him a little bit more of those easier throws, and that screams tight end to me. New York has allowed the most rushing yards through Week 2, but they are one of 3 teams that has yet to allow a rushing touchdown. I think that's going to change this week. St. Louis has run the ball more than any other team so far this season, and they have the most rushing yards to show for it. So not the best combination for New York. The Battlehawks running backs saw a lot of work in Week 2. Matt Jones with 16 carries, and he had that 25-yard touchdown catch. Christine Michael bounced back in Week 2, at least with his touches, had 15 carries and 2 catches. Jordan Tiamu was very accurate throwing the ball again, 74% in Week 1, 81% in Week 2. Those are his completion percentages. He also led quarterbacks in rushing yards again in Week 2. So, again, those extra points rushing, they really make a big deal, especially in this condensed version of a football game that we're seeing in the XFL here. DeMornay Pearsonell benefiting from his accurate QB and the most concentrated pass game for wide receivers in the league. 85% of St. Louis targets go to the wide receiver. So caught 9 passes and a touchdown in Week 2. He made a ridiculous catch on a 3rd down from their own 1-inch yard line. The ball was thrown behind him, and he reached back and snagged it, took a hit. He is 2nd in the league right now in catches behind only Nelson Spruce. LaDamian Washington also with a great day receiving with his 6 catches for 77 yards and a touchdown on 8 targets. 4 touchdowns for St. Louis in Week 2, but they had no extra points. They were 0 for 4 on attempts after touchdowns, including Tiamu getting sacked and Matt Jones getting stuffed at least once. I missed the other 2 extra point attempts, but they're not looking good on those short yardage plays. We'll see if they can change that this week. I'm definitely going to pay up for Matt Jones this week in FanDuel because I think St. Louis is going to win the game, and I think Matt Jones is in line to see the most work of any running back in Week 3. He seems to have a great matchup, and I think those St. Louis fans are definitely going to give him a little bit of a boost there in the Battle Dome, as they're calling it. We will get to my my 3-leg parlay and my DFS lineup towards the end of the show here. But yeah, so that's Guardians at Battlehawks. Let's move on to the next game here. We got the Houston Roughnecks, 2-0, going down to Tampa Bay, playing the Vipers, who are 0-2. They're looking for their first win. Roughnecks are -6.5, so the home team's getting a touchdown here, and the over-under set at 45.5 right now. The Roughnecks coming off of that win against Seattle, 28-24, and the Vipers coming off of a loss against Seattle, 17-9. P.J. Walker looked like the best quarterback again in Week 2, throwing 3 touchdowns, all of them to Cam Phillips, despite only having 170 passing yards. He was using his legs to manipulate the pocket and buy time. He looked awesome on his first touchdown. He started to move out of the pocket. It looked like he was going to escape and take off running, but he stopped on a dime and threw a bullet to Cam Phillips, who caught it at the back line of the end zone. It was a beautiful play. After the second touchdown, Walker dropped back, and there was nobody open, so he tried running it in, and he got stuffed at the goal line. On their third touchdown, they went for a 1-point attempt from the 17-yard line after a penalty. Raheem Malone got the target, but they did not convert. Then on the fourth touchdown, they had a successful rush attempt by P.J. Walker. So another team that's kind of struggling with those short yardage points after touchdown plays. We'll see if that's a league thing or if it's just a couple teams that are struggling, but it definitely seems like it's not working out like they thought. I think a lot of people thought we were going to see these extra point attempts scoring all over the place, but it just hasn't worked out that way so far. James Butler, running back. He could be one of the most underrated, least talked about guys coming into this season. He scored his third touchdown last week. He is definitely benefiting from having a threat at quarterback like P.J. Walker. You go back and you look at through the NFL over the years, if you have a quarterback that poses a threat with his legs, it generally opens up rushing lanes for the running backs. And like I said, James Butler's definitely benefiting from that. The other running back on this team that's surprising a lot of people, Nick Holley. He looked awesome in the passing game. He showed great hands and route running as a guy they thought was just another average running back. He kind of looks like a poor man's Rex Burkhead out there running corner routes and making big catches. However, I am avoiding Holley in FanDuel this week, though. The Vipers have allowed the fewest passing yards through the first 2 weeks and have yet to allow a single receiving yard to running backs. Now, it's definitely a extremely small sample size, but it's a 10-week season. You can only go by what you got. And the Vipers definitely seems like one of their defensive strengths is keeping pass-catching running backs at bay. As I mentioned earlier, Cam Phillips balled out with his 3 touchdowns last week. He has the second most targets among wide receivers in Week 2, and he delivered. The stats all say that the Vipers have a good pass defense as well, which makes me want to avoid the roughneck wide receivers. But I got fooled by the Houston and St. Louis game last week, so I'm kind of torn on these guys. The Houston offense just looks so good. It seems like it's the offense that you want to have stock in fantasy at least. Houston has allowed the fewest receptions to tight end so far, but they haven't really faced a guy like Nick Truesdell, so I've been waiting for him to have a big game. Maybe this is the game. If Tampa Bay finds itself trailing like I believe they will, Truesdell, Dan Williams, and Reese Horn are going to see a lot of targets. Reese Horn might be a sneaky play on FanDuel with his 13 targets so far this season. Jacquizz Patrick was the better Viper running back in Week 2, but I think the short yardage goal line job is still Devion Smith's. He got a pitch on the 1 point after touchdown attempt following the 78-yard pick six. The Vipers defense has now scored a touchdown before the offense has. No offensive touchdowns, but a defensive touchdown for the Vipers through 2 weeks. And the Viper offense, they haven't looked all that great. Smith and Patrick are number 2 and 3 in rushing yards through week 1 and 2. So this offense, despite being down in both games, they're sticking to the run. So maybe these are guys, they're safe plays in DFS or your seasonal leagues. Viper quarterbacks have now thrown 5 interceptions in 2 games. 2 different starting quarterbacks in 2 weeks, with Quentin Flowers sprinkled in there. Cornelius, which sounds like a fake name, completed only 59% of his passes for just 154 yards. He was sacked 3 times against Seattle. He didn't look any better than Aaron Murray did in week 1. I think they need to just completely sell out to Quentin Flowers and try and run an offense as similar to what we saw with Lamar Jackson and the Ravens, which I know is a lot easier said than done. But you look at the makeup of their team, they're kind of close. They got 2 good running backs who are averaging over 4.5 yards per carry between the 2 of them. They have a tight end that can run every route and be productive in the pass game, and they have wide receivers that can get down the field. The question is, can Truesdale help in the run game like the Ravens tight ends did last year, and can the wide receivers create separation like Hollywood Brown was able to do? And plus, can Quentin Nelson take the kind of hits that we saw Lamar Jackson take over and over and over last season? I don't know, but they got to do something because this offense just looks confused. All right, next game here. We got the Dallas Renegades at the Seattle Dragons. Renegades are giving up 5 points. The over-under is set at 43.5. Both of these teams are 1-1. Dragons looking to take advantage of that awesome home crowd that they were afforded last week. Cameron Artis-Payne with the best running back performance we've seen in the XFL so far. 130 total yards, 14 carries, caught all 5 targets. He had 2 touchdowns and a successful extra point attempt after the touchdown where he rushed up the middle on a direct snap. He had a second point after attempt on a direct snap, but it was no good. He's the only running back with at least 3 targets to catch all of his passes thrown to him. This Dallas offense targets its running backs more than any other team in the league. Dallas's running backs are number 1 and 2 in receptions and receiving yards among running backs. So look for Cameron Artis-Payne and Lance Dunbar to continue catching a lot of passes, which, like I said last week, I really think that's going to be the primary value in a lot of these XFL running backs is how involved are they in the passing game. Lance Dunbar also had his second good game in a row, 76 total yards on 11 touches. This could be one of the most productive backfields in the XFL by the end of the season. Donald Parham was a monster in week 2, catching Landry Jones's first XFL touchdown pass. He tied DeMornay Pearsonell for the most targets among all pass catchers in week 2. He's now 3rd in the league in targets through week 2, and he's 1st in targets, receptions, and receiving yards among tight ends. Landry Jones obviously likes to throw to him, so if you don't mind paying up for a tight end, Parham should be the guy you go for in DFS this week. Through 2 weeks, Seattle has allowed the 2nd most receptions and receiving yards to tight ends, so Parham should have another big game. Sean Price, the number 2 tight end for Dallas, is 3rd in the league in targets among tight ends, so maybe go with Price and get a good matchup as a good cheap tight end option. Landry Jones made his much-anticipated XFL debut in Week 2 and threw for 300 yards, the first 300-yard passer in the XFL. He completed 70% of his passes. He was interviewed after the game, and he said, "I played as bad as I could play." Head coach Bob Stoops was also interviewed, and he said, this kid, he hasn't played football in years. Pretty much had 4 practices the week going into that game after missing the last 5 weeks with that injury. If this is Landry Jones's floor as a fantasy quarterback, I cannot wait to see what his ceiling is. 300 yards, pretty awesome. Flynn Nagel was one of the guys that took a step back in Week 2 after leading the Renegades in catches and yards in Week 1. Hopefully that was the result of something the defense was doing and not Landry Jones deciding against throwing to him. He had 6 targets in Week 1 and only 3 in Week 2, so if you're a Flynn Nagel owner, you definitely want to see that target share go up. And then Jazz Ferguson, one of the more hyped wide receivers coming into the league, saw only 3 targets in week 1 and none in week 2. I'm very surprised at how this offense is distributing the targets. Their wide receivers have seen only about 40% of the targets each week so far. Like I said after last week, this is the clearest RB committee in the XFL, talking about the Dragons running backs. All 3 are good. Farrow's the bruiser, Gardner's kind of the scat back, and Trey Williams a little bit of both. But all 3 saw between 10 and 11 carries, with Trey Williams getting the only running back target on the team. Another week that Gardner does not see a single target. I'm going to continue to avoid these guys in fantasy until one of them inevitably gets hurt. That's just the way football is. Austin Proehl went from 10 targets down to just 4, like I said. He's now only caught 42% of his targets. Not great. Keenan Reynolds had the big game for the Dragons last week with his 87 yards on 3 catches, including his 68-yard touchdown catch. He looked awesome. He added to his stat line later in the game when he caught a 2-point reception after the pick 6, which was his second point after touchdown reception. So seems like they like him in the short yardage and in the deep throws. The Dragon defense and the crowd deserve a lot of credit for their first win. Brandon Silvers did not play well at all. Only completed 39% of his passes, and he threw a pick 6. So 75% of his passing yards came on that one long touchdown to Keenan Reynolds. Silvers must play better in week 3 if they want any chance to win. All right, moving on. The DC Defenders at the Wildcats. 44-point over-under. The Wildcats are getting 8 points at home. DC looks like they have one of the best trios of wide receivers. Rashad Ross has the second most receiving yards through week 2. DeAndre Tompkins returned to the field after missing week 1, and he led his team in targets and receptions, and he scored. Besides Houston, who doesn't even have a tight end on their roster, only St. Louis has targeted their tight ends less than the Defenders have. Yet they are the only team with a tight end touchdown in both weeks 1 and 2. So the Wildcats have allowed the most receptions and receiving yards to tight ends, so look for Kari Lee to have another big game. Donald Pumphrey saw 3 times more touches in week 2 than he saw in week 1, 78 total yards on 15 touches. He now has 8 targets on the season after only getting 5 last week. The Wildcats have also allowed the most receiving yards and receptions to running backs, and only Dallas targeted their running backs more than the Defenders. So both the Defender running backs and tight ends have great matchups in this game. I really like Donnell Pumphrey this week on FanDuel because he should see plenty of touches in this game. DC, again, 0-3 on their extra point attempts in week 2, bringing them to 1-7 on the season, with Pumphrey the only successful defender to score an extra point. They tried a 3-point attempt last week with a double pass, Cardell Jones to Tyler Palka to Rashad Ross, which was no good, but it definitely was exciting. The DC defense playing great against they had another pick 6, their second in as many games to go with the special teams touchdown they scored in week 1. DC leads the league in turnovers with 6, 4 of them interceptions. DC has been one of the more balanced teams as far as the run-pass ratio, but with LA allowing the most passing yards and passing touchdowns through week 2, I expect Cardell Jones to throw a lot in this game. The change of defensive play caller did not help much for the Wildcats last week. They gave up 3 touchdowns and allowed Landry, like I said, 300 yards in his first game in over 2 years. They gave up 444 total yards, the most net yards surrendered by any team so far in the XFL. LA was 1 for 2 on extra point attempts, and the good attempt was that 3-point attempt in which they got the ball on the 5-yard line because of a defensive penalty. It's not a great matchup for Nelson Spruce, as the Defenders have allowed the fewest receiving yards and the second fewest receptions to wide receivers. Josh Johnson looked decent, but not great in his return. Only a 54% completion percentage. So he's got to play better for sure. All right, I want to get to my three-legged parlay real quick. for week 3. So we got Houston at Tampa Bay. I'm taking the under 45.5. It's the highest total for week 3. Houston looks like the best offense in the league, but they were at home both weeks 1 and 2. Tampa Bay is still without an offensive touchdown through the first 2 weeks. Tampa Bay has allowed the fewest passing and rushing yards so far this season. So Tampa Bay's defense is not bad. So I'm going to go with the under in that game. I'm also going to take under 44 in DC at LA. DC's offense is also pretty potent, but again, they were also home for weeks 1 and 2. LA's defense played better last week than they did in week 1, but I think another week with this new play caller on defense should do them well. DC leads the league with 7 turnovers forced, so that defense should show up in this game. And then my last pick is the Battlehawks money line. Home opener for St. Louis. Should be loud as hell there in St. Louis. We just saw Seattle's crowd play a big part in their win. I think this St. Louis fan base can do the same. The Guardians' offense looked atrocious last week, and now they have to go into the Battle Dome. This game has the largest spread, and I would go with the home favorite if it was a one-possession spread, but with this, it's 10 points, and St. Louis is definitely one of the more conservative teams in the league. So I'm going to take the St. Louis money line. I'm going to take the under on DC at LA and Houston at Tampa Bay. And then real quick here, sorry to rush the end here, my XFL FanDuel lineup for week 3. I got Cardell Jones at quarterback for 20, Donnell Pumphrey at running back for 13. I'm playing 2 tight ends, Kari Lee for 14 and Donald Parham. Cam Phillips is in my flex. He's the most expensive position player at $21, but I think he's well worth it. And then you got Matt Jones in my flex for $16. I know this is a weird lineup in that I have 2 running backs and 2 tight ends, but has the most expensive wide receiver, top 2 expensive tight ends, and the 3rd most expensive quarterback and running back. Pumphrey is definitely the value play. This is not a lineup that you're going to see a lot, but I just think all these guys have great matchups, especially Matt Jones playing the worst run defense, and Donald Parham and Kari Lee and Donald Pumphrey both playing the team that allows the most receptions and receiving yards to their positions respectfully. Obviously, with these FanDuel lineups, you want to go for those stacks, which is why I'm taking DC QB and 2 guys that I think are going to be very much involved in the pass game. So that's going to do it for the Week 3 episode of the XFL preview, Kickin or Stickin Fantasy Football Podcast. Thanks for tuning in, everybody. Make sure you check us out next week. Hopefully my 3-leg parlay will do good this week, so I'm not embarrassed next week. And as always, may the fantasy gods be cruel to your opponents.
You have been listening to the Kickin or Stickin Fantasy Football Podcast. For more great episodes and information, follow us on social media and tune in every week. Kickin or Stickin is available on Google Podcasts, iTunes, iHeartRadio, Spotify, Alexa, Reach.tv, or your favorite podcast service. Kickin or Stickin is a proud member of the HC Universal Network family of podcasts. To find out more about this and other great shows on our network, visit us online at hcuniversalnetwork.com today. Fantasy football is fun, but gambling addiction destroys lives. If you or someone you love suffers from gambling addiction, please do not be afraid to seek help. The National Council on Problem Gambling operates the National Problem Gambling Helpline Network. Contact them today at 1-800-522-4700. Thank you for tuning in to the Kickin or Stickin Fantasy Football Podcast. Please remember to play responsibly and always look for your man downfield.